Hi, I'm Caroline Leavitt. I'm the co-founder of A Mighty Blaze, which grew out of the Nothing is Canceled book tour, which I started the day of the pandemic because my book tour was canceled and so were all the tours of my friends. And I said, this just cannot happen. To my surprise, it grew into A Mighty Blaze. We now have 30 passionate volunteers working for us. We've interviewed just about everybody. And today is completely special because today we're interviewing Mary Calvi. And this book, If a Poem Could Live and Breathe, which is about Teddy Roosevelt's first love. And it's extraordinary. It's totally extraordinary. So let me tell you a little bit about the book, a little bit about Mary, and then we'll talk. Mary Calvi, as everybody knows, is a 14-time New York Emmy Award-winning journalist for WCBS TV, and she's a weekend anchor of Inside Edition, a great, great show. Her second novel, If a Poem Could Live and Breathe, a novel of Teddy Roosevelt's first love, is based on these extraordinary love letters from the Gilded Age to and from Roosevelt and his first love, Alice Lee. Many of these letters have never been published. Many were believed to be destroyed. She's done the same in-depth research for this book as she did for her debut book, which is also really great. Dear George, Dear Mary, a novel of George Washington's first love, which is the basis of a Smithsonian Channel documentary. So, If a Poem Could Live and Breathe is a love story, first of all, but it's also a brilliant history. And I was talking to Mary before we got on the show saying that I had this preconceived idea of Teddy Roosevelt, that he was this big, gruff guy who went around saying bully and he was hunting all the time. And this book turns that idea on its head. Teddy Roosevelt is actually tender. He has a brilliant mind and a loving heart. And this is his love story with Alice Lee. And when Alice died after childbirth, Roosevelt fell apart, cutting her photo from the frames, refusing to even speak her name. Yet because he weathered this tragedy, you can see how it changed him into the kind of president he became. So using never before published letters, many thought to be destroyed, Calvi has crafted a love story, a revelatory historical novel, and also a stunning work of fiction, which I want to talk about too. So let me just read some of the raves that are racking up, and then I promise we will talk to Mary. Publishers Weekly said, another solid presidential love story. The authenticity of Theodore's feelings for Alice is made palpable in this magnetic narrative. The Historical Novel Society called it an entertaining novel to devour with tissues nearby. I would second that. I mean, my eyes were watering, and that's always my litmus test. Booklist raved, Calvi's portrait of Washington is a fascinating and unique look at pre-Revolutionary War society. And Library Journal says, drawn from scores of primary sources, Calvi's intricately crafted reimagining of a relationship will fascinate historical fans and romance lovers alike. So welcome, Mary Calvi. I'm so completely jazzed and so honored and so kind of awed by your presence. And I loved your book. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, Caroline, I can't thank you enough. It's so special to be with you and to talk to you. So thank you for having me. I am just so thrilled to be with you.
Me too. Me too. Okay, so my first question is, I absolutely love your view of history, that what we believe is our common knowledge of what happened and who people were isn't always the truth. And because of you, the truth about Teddy Roosevelt is so much richer. I really want to tell listeners and readers out there that forget everything you think you know about Teddy Roosevelt. This is something really different. If a Poem Could Live and Breathe gives us a Teddy Roosevelt in love. He's young, he's passionate, and he's deeply in love with Alice Lee, a name that was lost in history and has come back. So what I want to know is, how did you start with this? What was haunting you that you felt you were going to write this book? And why did you make it fiction?
Oh,
I'm glad you did, but I want to know why.
I mean, just such brilliant questions. And I think that my feeling in regard to why did I even start the research to begin with is that I had always known the story of Teddy and Alice, but it was my understanding that so much of their story was sort of like gone, And after
Yeah,
I had done the research about George Washington's first love, Mary, who was actually named a traitor in the American Revolution, and people
it's
know
unbelievable.
they never think of who's Mary. And when I started the research with George and Mary, and I really focused my attention on Mary, and it was like the documents were pouring out of the archives because most people would research George Washington, and you're surrounded by millions of documents. So I surrounded my research around Mary. Now, when I decided to do the second, to just at least start the research, I said, well, let me see if I could center my research around Alice. So before I started even doing that, I said, let me see what Teddy wrote in his diaries. I knew his diaries existed. And I went to the time that he would have been dating Alice. And honestly, Caroline, I was amazed at how many entries are about Alice and how thrilled he is and how happy he is and what a wonderful time he's having. But biographers of Teddy Roosevelt have written something completely different. In
Right.
fact, they wrote things like Alice, so she was bland and unsophisticated and boring, and even wrote something as cruel as this, said if Alice had survived, Teddy Roosevelt would have committed suicide from sheer boredom.
That's
Well,
insane.
and it hurt me. And I said, wait a minute, his diary entries are completely different than that. And those biographies had also said that the love letters had been destroyed, albeit a few, and where the pictures had been ripped out of their frames. But I thought to myself, and I wanted to ask you what you thought, but like, if a man was so in love with this woman, he's writing about her every single day in his diary, would he have destroyed love letters? Would he have ripped apart these pictures? Or would he have kept them dear? Would he have treasured him? Would he have treasured them and her? And so that's when I said, let me go in and see what I could find to see if maybe history was wrong when it came to Alice.
That's incredible. That's completely incredible. And the letters, there's so much the letters in the book. And the way he writes is so moving. He said, I'm living in a dreamland. How I wish it could last forever. No mortal could ever be happier than I am. I can never express how I love her, and I should love her twice as much and as tenderly. It would not nearly be as much as she deserves. It's just so, so moving. So let me ask you again about why did you fictionalize this? Because you deal in facts, and
Well,
crafting stories.
and I think certainly this book could have easily been a nonfiction, and maybe in the future it will be. But I felt like, I wanted to be in those intimate moments with them. And, it's hard to do that when you're not in the room with them. And so
Right.
I thought, in order to really feel close to them, I really wanted to create the scenes that I thought would work with what I had historically. I even have them, sleigh riding. I know exactly what they did because Teddy Roosevelt wrote about every single date they were on. So I thought it
Wow.
would be wonderful to sort of just open up their world and like what did it smell like, what did it look like, what did it feel like, and so that's really why I decided to do it as fiction. And so, but there's so much historical beautiful information that I wanted to be able to share with readers, and of course share Alice's voice with readers. But it was a very difficult decision, I'll be honest with you, deciding between fiction and nonfiction because there was just so much there that hadn't been published. But this gave just me the opportunity to just go one step further, sort of be in that moment with them when the first kiss happens.
It's perfect. It's perfect as fiction because, the structure is so interesting because it switches point of views. So we get in Alice's head and we also get in Teddy's head. It goes from the past to the present. There are poems. I don't think you could do that as well or as brilliantly if you did it in nonfiction. It's incredibly, incredibly moving. So what I wanted to know is how did you decide on the structure? Did you know, well, I'm going to go into this point of view and then I'm going to go to the past? Or did it just sort of come out organically? And did it drive you crazy until you knew what you were going to do?
Well, I think from day one, I understood the heaviness of it, being that I was writing about Teddy Roosevelt. And like you said, like I was getting in his head. So it was very serious for me because I wanted to be very careful and handle it very tenderly. And because I wanted to get into Teddy Roosevelt's head, I'm writing from his voice. I really wanted to start with him, and especially
Mhm.
start with him in the Badlands after Alice. And I really wanted to kind of capture what that grief would have been like for him, to understand like how difficult it must have been to overcome something just so unbelievably difficult. And being that it was just their relationship, they were just so close. Like I would say, like if you were to describe soulmates, that's how I would
Yes.
describe it. So I wanted to hear from Teddy Roosevelt for sure, and I wanted to start with him. And I thought from the very beginning I wanted to see him in North Dakota after Alice, because that's where he took off to, sort of like almost like running from what he was dealing with, and needing to be alone, to not be around anyone else, to just sort of deal with what he was dealing with.
Mhm.
One thing that I did know, Caroline, is that I knew that I wanted to see Alice through. I wanted to see her in the very last moments of her life. And I felt very
Yeah.
strongly that as I was reading her letters and getting closer to her and crying and knowing what was going to happen, I really wanted to know what that would have been like to be in her head and losing her life, and in those final breaths. And I went back to as much as I could read that other how other authors may have addressed it. I just went way back as far as I could. I wanted to see how authors addressed death, and almost in a way, kind of there might be a little bit of beauty in it, in that last
Mhm.
breath, and what that is like, and what that would feel like to the person who was going through it themselves. And so because of that, that's why I decided I wanted to hear from her, Alice, as well, because again, as we've been talking about, history has done her so wrong, that to give her a voice, I felt like was just as important as giving him a voice. And so that's why we go back and forth between the two of them.
It's perfect. Before we talk about Alice, I want to say that one of the last letters of Teddy that you printed in the book just has a big X, and it just says, "The light has gone out of my life." And just seeing that on one page is just absolutely heartbreaking, just so, so moving. So I want to talk about Alice, who was amazing. She was an early feminist. Her mom wanted her to go to finishing school. And for those who may not know, finishing school is, how to be a lady, what to wear, how to set the table, how to throw a party, all that stuff. Alice didn't want that at all. She wanted the same education men had, and she wanted it at Harvard. She was outspoken. She was brilliant. She was deeply, deeply loving. And as Teddy falls in love with her, we do too. Now, what I wanted to know, which wasn't in the book, was after Alice died and Teddy eventually remarried. What did it do? Do you know what his second wife thought about Alice? Because Teddy didn't want anybody to say her name. He cut her photographs out of the frames.
Yeah. So, Teddy had a very strong relationship with Edith, and they were good friends from when they were children. And so he had known her for many years. She also took care of Alice, their daughter, as she was growing up, and brought her into the White House, and she was a fine, fine companion. She was wonderful, and a great partner to Teddy Roosevelt. The one indication that we have of what Edith thought of Alice is that in one of the biographies, the writer did speak with Edith, and it was Edith that sort of had said that the letters don't exist, and the pictures are no longer around, and kind of didn't have very many nice things to say about Alice. But it is in history, and it's written down that Edith did throw party for the two of them when they were engaged. So I think she was very supportive about their marriage. But afterwards, after when she did marry Teddy, I think she put Alice aside. And there may be very good reasons for that, especially during that time. And here they are in the White House.
Right, right.
So I could understand that she might not want to be talking about the first wife, but I don't think there were very many positive things said by Caroline.
That's also, I wanted to talk. We were also talking about Alice, his daughter, who he called Baby Lee, not Alice, but she grew up to be the infamous Alice Longworth Roosevelt, who was the one who said, "If you don't have anything nice to say about anybody, come sit by me." And when I read that, I thought, "Oh my God, she's just like her mom. She has her mom's genes." It was extraordinary. So I wanted to know, I'm stealing a book club question that you had on your website, and everybody should go to the website because the photographs are amazing there. There's some interviews there that are just tremendous. You visited North Dakota 5 times while you were researching the book. Was each time different? Did it feel differently to you?
I think that when I was visiting North Dakota in the book, and we go through the stages of grief, I wanted an understanding of what Teddy would have felt like each and every time as he was kind of going through that stage of, when of acceptance at the very end. The one thing that I really enjoyed is experiencing North Dakota too through Teddy Roosevelt's words. He wrote so much about North Dakota. And so to be able to connect it and to be able to write about it was really special because I wanted to use his words and his understanding and his point of view. And so much of that in regard to North Dakota is actually from Teddy Roosevelt himself, because he does talk about the very difficult, extreme situations that he was in, falling off horses, breaking his arm. I mean, in monster storms and a beautiful, gorgeous, North Dakota is just such a beautiful, beautiful location. In fact, they're building the Teddy Roosevelt Presidential Library there.
Oh, that's great.
Right there in the middle of it all as he was going through and overcoming what he was going through. So, it's so meaningful that it'll be in that location. But for me to be able to experience what he was experiencing really took me spending a lot of time with his writings too, because it's one thing to see it, but it's another thing to understand it through another person's mind. And the fact that he had written so much about it really was able to give me an opportunity to connect to it truly through his eyes.
I want to talk a little bit more about the research because I want to mention that the book is so enchanting because of some of the details, and some of the details are funny. Like when I first saw somebody calling New York City the island of portly hogs, I started to laugh because, I thought, oh, they probably meant people were large. And then I read a page later that there really were hogs running down the streets. And it just sort of amazed me. That was such a wonderful detail.
I started, I went through Roosevelt's autobiography and went through his writings first, really before I put anything down on paper. And I laughed and laughed because Teddy Roosevelt is hilarious. And Caroline, it was like very difficult to write through his, because he's so funny. So I knew that I wanted to grab as many of those little elements as I could to sort of kind of give readers an understanding. Like, this guy is hilarious. I mean, he's as well as just a brilliant genius, and all of it. So I loved that piece of it. And oh gosh, there's so much because it's the Gilded Age. So
right.
So much that you could work with, and I did go through cookbooks from that time and to be able to and tested out recipes. So it was all
I was going to ask you that there are recipes on your website. I think one is for hot cross buns.
Yeah.
And I remember reading, I actually wrote down the ingredients of something called Duchess soup. That sounded interesting. So you did test them? Were they okay?
Did,
Did the kids
yes,
like
I did, and they didn't come out great, not because the recipes aren't great, but because I'm not, like, the greatest at in the kitchen, but, like, I tried, and so, I mean, they were very beautiful, but I figured I really wanted to kind of taste what it would be like, to have a hot cross bun made from that time. So, it was all great fun, honestly. I had such a good time. I really made a mess of the kitchen a number of times, but it was all great. It was
Oh,
all
it's wonderful. It's just, it makes history truly, truly come alive. I also wanted to ask you about the Gilded Age. Why was the Gilded Age so important?
There's so much to talk about when it comes to the Gilded Age, but one thing that I think I really spent a lot of time on it was about women and their treatment of women. And
Right.
Caroline, it was really incredible because you see women trying to get ahead in regard to education. And, not only are they trying to get this past the men who are in charge, but also past the women who are like, it was just not acceptable for women, to be educated, and that's coming from other women. And so
It's
these
incredible.
women who were like the quasi-feminists, the beginning, like really trying, they're not only like trying to get through to the men, but they also like have to get through to their moms and to their good friends who are like, what do we want to do that for? And so I think they were really in it, these women in the Gilded Age, just trying. And so it was just very slow, like one step after another. Probably at that time, I would imagine they're thinking, oh, this is never going to happen. But then years later, here we are.
And it
But
did.
it took them to just keep trying to allow us to, go to college and do things that we just think of like that's like no big deal. But boy, they were in it really, Caroline. And so that's the thing. I mean, while the Gilded Age, oh, there's so much you can talk about when it comes to the fashion,
Right.
the food, and everything that was happening in the music. Um, it was difficult to be accepted, especially for somebody like Alice, who, Teddy Roosevelt writes about, that they were debating poetry and politics. I mean, this was
I
just not
know.
something that was really being done at that time. And, she was attending his boxing matches. What? I mean,
Wow, I didn't know they allowed women in there. They did?
you know what? I don't know if they did.
Wow.
But also, she went into also that all male social club at Harvard, and she was the first woman to step foot inside. Women were just not allowed in there,
Wow.
and so she was like moving into doing things that like I loved, and so I thought how wonderful to be able to tell her story as somebody who's just trying to make it happen. And when Theodore Roosevelt, he delivers a speech at Harvard. And I wanted to mention this to you because this was so special to me. As I was researching Teddy Roosevelt at Harvard, I kept seeing this mention that he had a thesis about women's rights. And I thought, wow, but they only mentioned like 2 or 3 lines in all of the biographies, 2 or 3 lines from this thesis. And I said, well, I don't really want 2 or 3 lines. And you would understand this being
Of
such a reader
course.
for
Of
yourself.
course.
I wanted the whole thesis. And so
Right.
the 2 or 3 lines, so I kept looking and looking and looking. And Harvard was wonderful in trying to assist me, Harvard University. And finally, they came back to me and said, Mary, you're not going to find this thesis. And I said, oh, bummer. They said, well, but because it's not a thesis at all, it was actually a speech that Theodore Roosevelt delivered at
Oh,
in
oh,
1880. And I thought, a speech? That's
that's
so
even better.
much more relevant. And so
Yeah.
I was able to get a hold of it, saw the original. It's just written so beautifully. And like you could still see the line, the threads where he pulled it out of the composition book. And so it is so significant in regard to fighting for women's rights. I was quite stunned by it. And we do know that Alice was there as he delivered this speech. And so to be able to share that speech in the book was really important to me because I think it moves Teddy Roosevelt's story a step further and allows research to have new material to study him. And so I really enjoyed that piece of it. And, I'm sure with you too, in so much of your research, it's wonderful to be able to share something with readers that they may not have known before.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. I wanted to ask, in terms of Alice's impact on the kind of president that Teddy was. I mean, Teddy always, he had a strong mom and strong sisters. And here comes Alice. Do you think that president you think he would have been if Alice had lived? I mean, is there, and I guess there's no way of really knowing,
Well,
but
I think that what I can say is this, is that I believe if Alice was in Teddy Roosevelt's life, I think the women's movement would have moved further, would have moved more quickly. It was going very slowly at that point. And I think that when it comes to women's suffrage, I think we would have seen that move into the fold much earlier. I mean, in this speech he delivered while he was graduating, a senior in college, he was talking about women should become lawyers if they want. Women should be able to have property. I mean, it was just very, very progressive for that time. But he stepped back from it a little bit. And we do know in history that his second wife, Edith, didn't have those same thoughts about women's rights. And I think that if Alice had been there, I think we would have seen things moving more quickly. And of course, nobody would know. Nobody knows what would have happened. And things may have changed. History may have been different, actually, if it wasn't Alice's death. But that's what I was seeing in regard to the two women and the influence they may have had on his life.
We have an audience question. I loved your book. It's so interesting to me that our opinions of political and historical figures change as our times change. Do you think that will always be the case?
Oh, isn't that so true? I think
yeah, it is.
The more we go back and look at, especially at political figures and historical figures, the more we find this was something that was really, really shocking to me, is that so much exists that has never been published. I mean, even in the George Washington story, I was really, really, I really found it extraordinary how many documents that have never been published. And then in the Teddy Roosevelt, the fact that his love letters are all there waiting to be seen and just never published. I mean, that really, so yes, there's no question that everything will change, because the more we look, the more we find.
Right, exactly. I wanted to ask you too, in terms of all the things that are hidden, now we're in an era where they're trying to hide things in the history book and change things to sort of whitewash what's going on. And I always feel that, you know what, it's not that we always have to have a positive image of America that makes a country great or whatever. It's that we know how far we've come. I mean, why can't we talk about slavery, or why can't we talk about what's going on with Native Americans? Are you alarmed by how history is changing, by what we allow in the history books? Do you see this as sort of a problem? And if so, what can we do about it beside, I mean, I keep donating money, but what else can we do?
I think that we should open ourselves up to telling more stories. I mean,
yeah, it's a great answer.
How, to be able to go back in history and look at maybe the documents that have never been published in regard to Native Americans, maybe from their point of view. I think that's one thing that's really interesting to me, is that in regard to when I was researching Teddy and Alice, nobody had ever thought to, well, let me look at Alice, let me really research Alice. I think that we're just only going by what other people are saying. So maybe we need to go in there and tell more stories about the folks that have never gotten a chance to be heard. So we hear so much about, our political figures. There are so many other people that their stories haven't been told. So I think telling more stories and being able to do more research, historical research, I think really opens up the world and opens up the literary world to new voices. I think that's kind of what I was finding, that I was through as I've done this historical research, and I'd love to hear, because I know you've done so much as well, that what we think doesn't exist, the documents that we don't exist, the letters, they actually do. So go in there and really dig. I think that it gives you an opportunity to really experience history in a whole new way. And to do it from different perspectives, I think is really, really interesting.
Exactly. When I first started doing research, the writer Mary Morris told me, don't look just for the facts, look for the stories. And I started to get it, because the more I talked about things with people who might have experienced such a thing or went through things, the more you get this really surprising perspective that is extraordinary. I mean, I found somebody who actually had lived next to Charles Manson before he was infamous. And I said, well, what did you think? And he said, well, we just thought he was kind of, a dirtier than usual hippie guy. And he would, sometimes he wouldn't give good tips to the waitresses, but nobody thought he had the brains to ever have that much power. And hearing that, it changes the narrative of here's this guy who could control everyone.
Yeah.
And it's so different. So interesting. Oh, we have another audience question. Great. Okay. Can you talk about what you're working on now?
Oh, sure, Caroline. Well, I really adore searching through history and looking at love letters, especially when we can look at a president as a very young man. So I did start, and I'm not sure what's going to come of it. And so I'm working on a few things. But one of the things I really adored looking at were the letters of Abigail Adams.
Oh, she was amazing.
Yeah, and her "Remember the Ladies" line we all know. So I wanted to just go back and see what her life was like, and there are like thousands of letters between them that exist, and not much has ever been done in regard to her when it comes to historical fiction. So I thought, well, let me explore her. One of the things that was really actually that's just sitting with me for it, and it has been for quite a while, is that she watched with her young son the Battle of Bunker Hill, and just
Wow.
watched, just the place being burned down and people she dying. And she watched it from high atop a hill. And I thought, gosh, what life must have been like for somebody like Abigail Adams, holding her little boy's hand and watching her whole town just burn down. And how do you overcome that? And how do you move on with your life and go through the whole American Revolution? And then, your husband's the president, your son's the president. I mean, there's such responsibility, and the weight of that must have been so heavy for her. So I've really been enjoying just reading her letters and understanding who she was as a person. They're brilliant. I mean, she's such a writer, and I love that she's a feminist and really pushing the ladies' causes. So she didn't get very far, but again, we were in the Gilded Age, and they didn't
Right.
get very far. Boy, it took us a long time, centuries here. We keep working. But so I really have enjoyed reading that. And I also went back and looked at Abe Lincoln as a young man. He also had a woman, his life named Anne.
Yeah.
And so I've been researching them as well. So all of that, I really enjoy the historical research, and whether they'll end up becoming published novels, I'm not sure, but I've just really been spending a lot of time with them, and that's been really a joy for me.
We have another question from H.S. Brett. Your novel sounds fascinating. Can't wait to read it. It is. It's really wonderful. You must have visited Sagamore Hill. How did it impact your writing?
Oh gosh, I mean, Sagamore Hill is such an extraordinary place, and I really loved being there and just being on the grounds. And I was really, I really adored the writings about Sagamore Hill by Theodore himself. There's so much in his diaries about Sagamore Hill, and when he was engaged to Alice, they already started talking about how they were going to make the changes at Sagamore Hill and build the house of their dreams. And so you see a lot of that between the two of them in their writings. That never came to be, unfortunately, with Alice's loss, but he did end up building Sagamore Hill. So, oh gosh, yes. I mean, Sagamore Hill had a great impact on me, and I spent quite a bit of time there, as well as other Theodore Roosevelt locations. His birthplace in Manhattan is a lovely museum as well. And so you really have to be at the locations, at the settings, to understand, again, what it felt like, what it smelled like, because he's right by there, right by the water there. And so I wanted to really be able to offer that in the writing as well. So yeah, I did spend a lot of time at Sagamore Hill, and it changed everything. Really, I think everything is based on what I learned when I was there.
I have another question for you. You're this incredible, inspiring success. So, just as we read about how Teddy was shaped by the women in his life and the people in his life, what do you think the factors were that helped you to succeed so brilliantly?
I think for me, my parents came over from Italy. They're immigrants from Italy, and my mom actually probably had the most influence on me, because I'll tell you a quick story. But when she was in her little town in Italy, they lived in a beautiful high hill surrounded by olive fields. It's really quite incredible. But at the time, everyone was leaving. It was right after the war, and she had gotten her immigration papers, and she was waiting for a ticket on the boat, and it came very quickly. And her dad, rushed and got her out of school and said, "We need to leave, and we need to leave now." So, she's a young girl, 12 years old, and she had like 1 hour to pack up everything into a little trunk and leave for this new world. And she really didn't get a chance to say goodbye. And she rushed onto the boat, and there she is in the Atlantic, realizing she had forgotten a coat. And it was a 1 month journey to come to New York. And I often think of her about what she had to do to get here, to get us, the opportunities. And so I never take that for granted. And so anytime I feel like, oh, it's way early, my alarm's going off, because I've got 4-year-old
Remember your mom.
I think of my mom, and she did all of that to get here without her coat, and in December. And so it wasn't easy for her at the very beginning, but she had this great hope, and she was so inspired by New York. And so for me, it really is all based on that, and what she did to make things happen and to make things work was just so overwhelmingly difficult. And so for me, I mean, I can never complain, because she's given me this beautiful opportunity, and here I am. So I'm
That's
forever
so
grateful.
lovely. Well, you're very, very inspiring. And I want to tell listeners out there again, go to your favorite indie bookstore to support your community, or you can just go to bookshop.org and they will find an independent bookstore near you. They'll all mail you out the book, and order Mary's book. Here's the gorgeous cover again. Oh, I'm sorry, it's backwards and I don't know how to undo it. If a poem could live and breathe, or her first one, Dear George, Dear Mary, which is just as completely wonderful. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for your wonderful questions. And I want to also thank Mary. I've been fangirling all week. So excited to talk about this, because I literally, I was so excited about the book because I love history and I loved the book. And I want to thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you.
Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next week.